This week's vlog question has to do with the relationship of grief and bitterness. The writer asks, my spouse has hurt me badly by having an affair. As a result of that, we lost many things, a large amount of money, trust, and peace of mind, to name a few. Admittedly, I'm really struggling. Several friends tell me I'm bitter, but I think I'm in the midst of grieving these losses. I don't deny that I'm angry, but isn't anger a part of the grieving process? How would I know if my grief was degenerating into bitterness? Is there a time limit, expiration date, statute of limitations, or some kind of emotional temperature gauge? Let me start again by saying thank you for your question. The dynamic that you describe, where grieving a significant loss can easily turn into bitterness, applies to many situations. A job loss, chronic pain or injury, the death of a loved one. Now, bitterness is always an awkward subject because it resides at the intersection of sin and suffering. Something happened to us, there was some offense, there was something wrong that shouldn't have happened that wasn't our fault, or else we wouldn't be bitter. And so that is suffering. But at the same time, this attitude of anger and resentment and cynicism begins to corrupt our soul and divide relationship to the point that we begin to take responsibility for that, and that part is sin. So we ask the question, what do bitterness and mourning share in common? What accounts for this intersection? Well, both are triggered by an event that is personal and negative. Both exist at the unpleasant end of the emotional spectrum. Whether we're bitter or grieving, it's not pleasant. Both feel justified and make sense in light of the event. Both are very natural, and they feel more like something that is happening to us than something that we're doing. Both grief and bitterness involve a high degree of mental repetition as we replay what happened over and over again. And both begin to shape the way that we think about events and people that are around us. Now, the similarity of bitterness and grief make it feel like it's nearly impossible to escape the vicinity of temptation. With some other temptations, we can just get away from it. We can not go to the bar where we're tempted to drink. We can avoid the computer where we're tempted to look at something that we shouldn't. But when it comes to bitterness, because it's something that's so internal, it doesn't feel like we can flee the vicinity of where temptation happens. Now, in order to help us think about this, I think another way to think of mourning is a step of pre-forgiveness. To be able to face the reality of sin's impact without succumbing to the desire for retribution or revenge is part of garnering the strength to say, I forgive you. And so whatever this temptation of bitterness is that we're facing is something that we have to be able to face to do what God calls us to do, which is to forgive. Now, in a booklet called Help, My Spouse Has Been Unfaithful, Mike Summers describes 6 things that bitterness does. What I'd like to do is to list those 6 things, but also look at what the alternative side of mourning would be. So if bitterness is the unhealthy side of it, what is that healthy side of mourning that I think would help navigate you through your question? And so the first thing that Mike references is that bitterness disrupts peace. Now, on the alternative side, I would say it's mourning that makes peace possible again. There is no peace where evil is called good or overlooked. Thinking about wrong over and over again is the essence of bitterness. One of the litmus tests for the degree of bitterness is how many details that we remember from the event. But now it's mourning that drains a wrong of its emotional power. Mourning something is something that we only do when we feel safe. And so by coming to a place where you can mourn what happened to you, it is a way to say that I'm safe. Again, think about it. A soldier who is in the field of battle and his comrade falls. He doesn't mourn in at that moment because he's not safe. When he comes home, then he mourns the loss of his friend. And so, as you think about what is the difference between bitterness and mourning, part of it is me acknowledging that the environment that I'm in is safe enough to go through these emotions. Now, second thing is that bitterness destroys joy. And oddly, mourning is the foundation for joy. Bitterness keeps pain in the present. Bitterness doesn't know any boundaries of time. Bitterness doesn't really have memories, it just has experiences. It's as if it's happening right now. It's mourning that allows pain to be in the past. It may still hurt, but you can see that this is a past hurt, not something that's happening right now in the present. And this provides the foundation for joy, so that as your present improves, you can separate. We're doing better now without having to say this didn't exist. I can mourn what happened then without it corrupting where I'm at now. Now, third thing about bitterness is that bitterness depletes us of strength, while mourning allows us to replenish our strength. Bitterness is a form of anger, and anger requires a great deal of energy. Anger feels strong, but that's because it's pulling from other resources and reserves that your body has in order to amp up this physical stamina. But that's inevitably going to result in a crash. Mourning, however, is a form of rest. When we mourn, we quit fighting for the ability to control our pain. We surrender, not to evil, but to allowing the past to be in the past. Now, fourth thing that bitterness does is that bitterness distorts our focus, while mourning allows us to restore our focus. Bitterness can't think of anything for long without it returning to the offense that ignited it. Every subject just seems to be a derivative of our pain and seems to be connected. Mourning, however, is the process that allows current events to stand on their own. Think about it. When you lost a loved one, chances are during that immediate time period after the loss, everything reminded you of them. It was hard to think of anything else. But after a time period of grieving, you could still remember them, and that pain may still be accompanied, or that memory may still be accompanied by pain or sorrow. But you could begin to live in this moment without it being completely distorted or distracted by your loss. Now, fifth thing is that bitterness defiles relationships, while mourning honors relationships. Bitterness defines relationships by the painful event. Often bitterness defines an entire gender by the painful event. This is just what men do. This is just what women do. And when we're bitter, our temptation is that we can often mistake cynicism for wisdom. But it's mourning that recognizes a painful event as real, but can see the marriage as being larger than that event. Mourning is what allows us to see your spouse's sin as part of the marriage, but not being the totality or defining event of that marriage. And then finally, bitterness displeases God, while mourning pleases God. Bitterness is a sin. It's not the sin, as if it's the worst of all sins. But like every sin, it displeases God and creates separation in our relationship with Him. At a time when you're already feeling separated from your closest relationship, that having been with your husband or with your wife, this sense of distance that sin creates between you and God can be particularly hard to accept. But think of it this way. God is pleased with our mourning and draws close to us in our sorrow to comfort us. When we resist that approach that comes with the adage, it's easier to be angry than hurt, then God approves of our courage that's represented in our grief. God does not delight in our pain, but He is pleased when you display His character and His strength in the midst of your pain. And while your mourning may not feel like faith, in the midst of suffering, it can be the essence of faith as you begin to express hurt as hurt instead of hurt as anger. And you express that both towards your spouse as you acknowledge your hurt and towards God as you pray to Him with it. I hope this has helped you think through the difference between grief and bitterness. I'll include several resources below this to help you maybe take some next steps if you found this helpful. Thank you.